Introducing our speaker, author, editor, science fiction author, writer, creator of such titles as Boilerplate and Heartbreakers, Anina Bennett.
Hi, I see several familiar faces there. Hi, everyone. Hey, Roberta. Hey, John. Nice to meet you, Maureen and Tim and Adrienne and Roger. I'm going to pronounce my name and don't feel bad about mispronouncing it. It's Anina Bennett, and I've spent my whole life correcting people. My mother was Hungarian, so that's the story behind that. And I am not a cartoonist. I do draw a tiny bit, but I'm a writer, and I worked as a comic book editor for, looking back, you know, a relatively brief period, about a decade, but it was during I feel like a particularly interesting period in comics, because there were a lot of changes happening that have really culturally and technologically. So it was right when digital technology was first coming along. It was when I was working as an editor, and there's a lot of cultural change happening as well. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of the cultural change when I talk about Friends of Lulu. So as an editor, I worked, and I do have some visuals, so I'll share that in just a second. But as an editor, I worked I started out at First Comics in 1989, and then I worked for Dark Horse, which is how I wound up moving out to the Pacific Northwest. First was based in Chicago, and then I briefly worked for Egmont Publishing, which was based in Denmark. And I actually worked a little bit with John on some Disney stories. I was editing Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck stories for this big company that does all the Disney comics in Europe. Then I went back to Dark Horse, and then I basically was freelancing for a while, and now I have a paying career in a totally different field. But I still really love the medium of comics. And I love the craft of comics, and I love the history, and I love a lot of the new diversity that we're seeing in terms of the material that's being published, the voices that are being heard. And I think it's actually a really amazing time right now in comics as a literary medium. So I have some, so I'm just going to walk through some slides and talk a little bit about some of the major projects that I've worked on, and a little bit of the you know, both the creative stuff and the cultural stuff around it, as well as an organization that I was involved in founding in the 90s, which both Donna and Roberta were involved in at least a little bit, called Friends of Lulu, which was a pretty ambitious effort to both get more women and girls involved in comics as readers, and to try to create a professional network, and to try to get publishers to listen to the fact that, yes, in fact, men are not your only audience. So that was part of the cultural change that I mentioned. And, you know, if anybody wants to ask questions at any time, I'm just going to rattle on for a while and show you some pictures. But if anybody wants to jump in with questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just say something. So let me get my slides going. And do I have sharing capability? Oh, do you need, oh, here we go, share screen. Okay. All right, can you see the pictures?
Yes, we can.
Great. This was one of the things I had to learn during the pandemic era, was how to do presentation on screen during a meeting and still be able to see the meeting and the rest of my screen. It was like, how do you do it? Okay, so the first thing that I did as a writer in comics and in books, Heartbreakers, Boilerplate, and Frank Reade are really the major projects that I've done. I did a few other, you know, writing projects here and there that were work for hire, but these are things that I created with my husband, Paul Guinan, who is an illustrator and a visual storyteller. And then Aztec Empire is Paul's current project, which is mainly his. I'm a little less involved in that one, but that one's a historical epic. So anyone who's interested in that kind of material, I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So these pages are from our very first Heartbreakers story. And Heartbreakers was, I'm still pretty proud of these stories, actually. There's certainly plenty that I would change about the writing if I were doing it now. Like these early stories are overwritten because we condensed them down from a planned miniseries to 8-page stories in Dark Horse Presents. But this is a pretty early example of women action heroes in comics. Not like, they're not superheroes. So the Heartbreakers are clones. The origin story is that they're all clones of this woman who invents a rapid cloning process, very sci-fi. So they're all clones of this woman who invents a rapid cloning and memory transfer process. Using RNA transfer technology that I read about in the 80s, which is actually currently being used in vaccines. So I'm also like, ooh, I was paying attention to science news at the time. So not that we have the capability to do that, but it was like these little granules of real science are the things that I feel like make science fiction believable. So they're all clones of the same woman, and she clones herself in 2 different batches. And one batch is engineered as lab assistants, basically, and the other batch is engineered as bodyguards or soldiers. And they exist basically in a near future Earth where clones are property. And so there's a few, it's basically an action series, but there's a few issues going on under the surface. Like reproductive rights are an issue for clones, but not in the way that we talk about them. They want the right to reproduce because they aren't allowed to have control over their own biology because they're property. So they're all actually owned by the corporation that she works for. And in these early stories, they're basically like trying to get away, like she's making a break for it. And they went through, these characters went through several iterations in both publishing format and kind of the way that we presented them and conceived of them. They're still the same characters, but they not only visually look different, but we really changed a couple of things about the way that we were approaching the stories. Some people weren't happy with it, but I think because these early stories are like really classic, science fiction action stories, we really, really loved Aliens and Terminator when they came out. And we like the fact that they had these really strong women in them. And at the time it was, in the 80s, like we hadn't seen a whole lot of that yet. So Paul and I wanted to do something like that in comics. And one of the things I really enjoyed about it was trying to figure out how to give these clones who were very similar to each other, at least slightly different personalities. So like the scientists and the soldiers have very different personalities. But even within those groups, I tried to kind of like give them slightly different dialogue. So that was fun. So these pages are, this one on the left is the cover of one of the early Dark Horse Presents stories that we did. And the first story was published at the very end of 1989, I think. And we had originally pitched it as a mini series, but we were both like totally new to being published in comics. And so Dark Horse actually got back to us and said, hey, we really like this, but we can't do it. And they were still a very young company at the time. And they said, we can't do it as a mini series, but how would you like to do it in Dark Horse Presents? And Dark Horse Presents was publishing like amazing stuff. And we wound up being in some of the same issues with Frank Miller's Sin City stories. We were in issues with Paul Chadwick's Concrete. I mean, like there was some really fantastic creator-owned work being done in Dark Horse Presents. And that was really their flagship anthology. And that was one of the big shifts that was going on in the comics industry at the time in the late 80s and the early 90s. Creator ownership of their work was really kind of a new concept in the comic book industry. Most work up until that point for the major publishers was done all work for hire, and that's why those companies own Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and all those other characters, because that was the only way you could do it. So this new model of creator ownership was really, there was like really an explosion of small press, independent, and sort of mid-sized publishing and self-publishing that really started in the 70s, and before that with the undergrounds, but in the late 80s and the 90s, it really started to take off. So Dark Horse Presents was a great example of that, and highly recommend looking for some of the early issues if you've never seen them. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So another fun fact, we used the titles of Howard Hawks movies. I don't remember why, but we liked this title for this story, and then I was like, oh, let's try and pick a Howard Hawks movie for like every one of them. So I think for the first, we did 2 batches of 3 3-parter stories, and I think we used Howard Hawks titles for all of them. So this is the very first page of the very first comic book story I ever had published, and you can see Paul's using a pretty detailed black and white art style here, and a lot of spatter. This is all hand done. He was really into toothbrush spatter at the time. And then this page is the very last page of the first story arc that we did, wherein, spoilers, we killed off all the characters except for one of each clone, including the original scientist. And I did not expect to get any reaction to that. It was just it's just how we wrote the story. And then they go on to have their own adventures in later books. But we actually got a couple of letters where people were like, what? You killed them? And it was like my first experience with having, felt like I actually made an emotional, I was like, wow, something I wrote had an emotional impact on people. That was a big deal. And this very last panel here was actually featured in an exhibit, along with some of our work, in an exhibit at the Oregon Historical Society. A couple of years before the pandemic, they did a really wonderful exhibit called Comic City USA. And they had a number of local comic book creators, as well as it covered comics, animation, and political cartooning. And it was like a pretty interesting intersection. I haven't actually seen that done before. So it was a really wonderful exhibit, and we were honored to be included, and they made that panel into a big blow up. And so we have that panel in our kitchen now. And then this is the next iteration of Heartbreakers. We wound up doing several story arcs in Dark Horse Presents, and then we did a mini series. This was in 1996. Every time I say these years, I can't believe how long ago the 90s were, but and I got really retroactively got kind of fascinated by the changes in comic book production technology that I saw, especially coloring. And so in more recent years, I've done a couple of panels, one of which is recorded and is on YouTube, about the history of comic book coloring, because this period was exactly when we were transitioning from hand color to digital color. And when I started at First Comics as an editor, people were still using blue line color, which several of you are probably familiar with, but I don't know if everyone is. So blue line color was the only way that we could get reproduce hand colored pages relatively easily in the 80s. There was a whole other process that I'm not going to get sidetracked into, I swear. But blue lines were, you would take the line art, the black and white line art, print it in non-photo reproduction blue on a board that hopefully was strong enough to not shrink. And at First Comics, the boards always shrank because they were too thin. And so our colors were always a little bit out of register. And then there was an acetate overlay that had the black line art with clear parts so you could see the coloring. And the colors would flip that back and forth, flip it up, color, flip it back down, flip it up, color, flip it back down. And you would do that for every page. And then those were photographed basically and separated for the printing. So by this time, people were doing digital separations, and we hadn't yet gotten to the model that we have now, where basically most comic books are colored by one person and they just do it all digitally. But at this point, there were only a few people doing that, and it was very clunky, and the files were unreasonably large for the storage media that we had then. I'm just fascinated by all the technical details. And so at this point, people were still doing what we call color guides, where they would take a photocopy of the artwork and color it in using markers or whatever, usually markers, sometimes watercolor, and then they would write the actual CMYK codes on the paper for like what all those different parts of the page were. And so you would get, you know, like the separators would get these pages with all these tiny little codes all over them. And then another person at Dark Horse, they had their own separations department. A lot of other people were starting to farm it out to places that specialized in digital coloring by this time. And then these people would sit in a dark room and interpret those codes and do the actual like tracing of the line work, you know, digitally on the computer and put the coloring in there. And one of the other things we were dealing with is that there was a lot of variation in paper stock at the time. And so these colors are like way more saturated than they were intended to be because the paper was more absorbent than the colorist expected. And this happened a lot in the early days of digital coloring. So it is what it is, but like none of this should have been, like the values should have been a little bit lighter than that. And it looks really different if you look at the original color guides for it. So this was our 4th issue miniseries. We got a few friends of ours to do the covers. This first cover is by Paul with our friend Tony Akins. The second one is Paul Chadwick, the concrete artist who we loved, and we wanted him to do a romance cover, like an old romance comic. The third one's Mike Allred, creator of Madman and the artist on iZombie, and more recently the David Bowie biography, I think. And then the last one's Dan Brereton, who does really awesome painted horror stuff. And so he was a natural for sort of a horror looking cover. So we actually packed a lot into this miniseries, and we also got a bunch of our friends to do pinups at the end. And that part was really fun. I'm really glad that we had all those extras in it.
Like a book 45.
What's that?
Oops, sorry.
Oh, was that accidental? Okay. So one of the things that we changed, and you can see that like compositionally, you can see that Paul is really like into these kind of formal layouts, and he's kind of pushing that even further a little bit with the series he's working on now, which I'll show a couple of pages from at the end. So in this story, the clones have like come back to Earth because there's a thingamajig, some DNA technology they need to retrieve. They're going up against the corporation that owned them to try and get the thing. And they've got this android who shows up in one of the later stories. And you can see there's like a ton of gunplay. And once again, I guess we were like easily influenced by movies because I was really into Jackie Chan movies at the time. And Paul and I were both pretty into John Woo was really big. So like these Chinese gangster movies where people are like flying through the air sideways and firing 2 guns, you know, as they fly halfway across the room. So we actually consciously made a decision to move away from that in our later stories, especially after the mass shootings of the 90s started. And we got really uncomfortable with in any way glamorizing gunplay. So everybody has to make their own decisions about that, but we made a really conscious decision to move away from it. And then the next iteration of Heartbreakers, we decided we really wanted to, in addition to not doing the gunplay anymore, we kind of really wanted to make the stories, we didn't want to have one massive arc that you had to follow throughout the entire series. And we wanted to just kind of explore different aspects of the character's world and do stories that were a little more accessible to an all ages audience. Or a younger age range at any rate. And I really, at the time before this, Disney had a digest that was actually pretty fun called Disney Adventures that was totally aimed at kids, but I liked it because it had all these different features in it, and it probably reminded me of like, you know, books and digests that I had when I was a kid. So we decided to do, I also liked it because digests fit on a bookshelf, and trade paperbacks that are comic book sized do not fit on standard bookshelves. And this was still, again, this was still like another thing that was still a huge issue at the time. A lot more bookstores stock graphic novels now, but at the time, a lot of them didn't. And one of the reasons they didn't is because they didn't fit on standard bookshelves. So that's changed a lot since then. But that was part of the reason that we wound up doing these. And these are anthologies where we did one main long story that was divided in 2, but it's still all in one. So like one and done, you can just read this volume, and it does connect to the other ones if you want to read them, but you don't have to, you're not trapped. So we also had a few stories in there from other people. So like we invited a few of our friends to, and paid them, of course, to do short stories featuring these characters. And the artwork in the main stories for these was done by Paul with our friend Lennon Delsol, who is actually an insanely talented painter. And if you're on Facebook, go look him up. His last name is Delsol. And he teaches painting now, and he's been posting a lot of his recent work, and it's like mind-blowingly gorgeous. It's really good. So in these stories, like I said, we wanted to have a little more fun with the characters, Paul also like always had some particular action sequence he wanted to do. So in this story, it was a motorcycle chase. So this story has a motorcycle chase in it. But the actual story in this one is that the Earth's crops are losing their nutritional value because of over genetic engineering. And so they go to a genetics convention to steal some OG plant seeds and genetics, or plant seeds to distribute to seed savers who grow stuff on rooftops. So like I mashed up a bunch of things I was interested in. And the convention scene, I actually should have put the convention scene in here because they actually go to the convention, and we made fun of comic book conventions and the things people ask you when you're standing behind your table at a convention. Like, is this free? Being one of the main ones. So we did 3 of these. These pages here are from the first 2, Heartbreakers Super Digest. And by this time we realized we had hit our 10th anniversary. So we were like, hey, happy 10th anniversary. So these are from the first one. These are from the second one, where they have a cross-country adventure and meet sand pirates. And then the third one, Heartbreakers meet Boilerplate. We brought together Heartbreakers with a character that that Paul had created and that we wound up doing after this, a whole hardcover book about, that's a Victorian robot who's built in 1893. So this one was done in 2005, and I've showed a little bit of the process here that Paul used for these digital pages, because this was like, you know, not at the dawn of digital art, certainly, but it was early enough in digital comics digital comics art process that he had to kind of make up his own way of doing it. There weren't like all these built-in things that can automatically make a character look like a comic book character or a drawing. Or there were, but you know, he couldn't get the compositions he wanted. So I wound up posing for the 2 main characters are Queenie and Delta, the scientist clone and the soldier clone. So I wound up posing for them and all the Heartbreakers, who are the other soldier clones. Oh, and fun fact about the dialogue, Queenie's dialogue, the original inspiration for the way Queenie talks is Sergeant Nick Fury, but like the old version from the from the comics I read in the 70s, probably, the scar chopping, you know. And not that I was trying to mimic that, but like that was the kind of character that I heard in my head when I was thinking about how Queenie talks. And Delta, who's the scientist clone, the inspiration for her was my paternal grandfather, who was a scientist and taught science for many years, and who was instrumental in the development of the electron microscope. So Paul did, oh, dang it. Can I go back? Yes, there we go. So Paul did all the art for this story digitally. And in this one, we didn't have other people. This was mainly us. And then we had some like backup features that were history or fake history. And in this one, the Heartbreakers find Boilerplate disassembled in an old crate, this old-timey robot. Scientist clone puts him back together. Bad guys come after him. Hijinks ensue. That's the story. But there's always like a little bit of something in there that I'm trying to, you know, sneak in amongst the action. So in the earlier stories, when we started doing Heartbreaker stories, cloning was still a pretty new concept outside of science fiction. And there was still a lot of debate about like, well, wouldn't clones all be exactly the same? Is it nature or nurture? And my attitude was always, well, duh, it's both. How can it be one or the other we are born a certain way, and then there's a lot of factors that influence that, and there's a lot of factors that influence you as you develop. So like the moment a clone is decanted, they start having unique experiences, and they are a different person than the other clones. So there's always kind of like this running thread of identity and bodily autonomy in these fun action stories. And in this one, this is really the only story where we ever address the question of whether or not our boilerplate robot is sentient. We don't really address that in the boilerplate book because it's all set in the 19th century and people didn't really think of robots that way. And so nobody ever talks about it in that book, but it's the main discussion amongst the clones in this. And so this is a little bit of Paul's process. You can just see that like he started with photos of me or friends of ours or neighbors of ours. And then this airplane is actually hanging in our hallway, not too far from here. And then he started out doing, still did his traditional thumbnails by hand, and he still does that. And then he would go through this whole process, and then he would, do a bunch of digital drawing and painting and filtering to get it to kind of look like that. And then I did all the lettering on these using Willie Schubert, who lettered our original series and designed our logo, was kind enough to let me use his font. And then jumping from, so that's Heartbreakers. And then I wanted to go to Friends of Lulu before I talk a little bit about Boilerplate and Frank Reade. And you may notice a familiar face in one of those photos reaching for a glass in the foreground. So Friends of Lulu was an organization that I can't take credit for like actually, inspiring people to start it. My friend Heidi McDonald, who now runs a news outlet called The Beat, which covers comics and pop culture. And in the photo on the left, it's Heidi sitting right in the middle talking. So Friends of Lulu, she was really the main person who kind of got everyone together to talk, and this was where it started from. And this was a nonprofit that we formed in the 90s that I think I said earlier that we had a pretty ambitious mission. We were, it was originally pretty much all women who worked in the comics industry. And we wanted to try to convince publishers that they should publish more diverse types of material and that there was an audience for it. We wanted to try and help create a professional network for women in comics. And we wanted to encourage women and girls to read comics and to show them that there are comics for you. And, like if they were, this again was a different era, but if they were like being, accompanying someone to a comic book convention and they weren't necessarily into it, we Friends of Lulu would be there to like, talk to them, ask them what they like to read, like we ran a survey was one of the first things we did. So this all grew out of, I'm not going to talk in detail about the origin of it. And there's actually a discussion I did with Heidi that's also on YouTube. So I have a YouTube channel where I have a couple of playlists and things like that. So if you're interested in any of this historical stuff or the coloring panel, that's all on my YouTube channel. For a lot of different reasons, Heidi got a bunch of women together at a cafe in San Diego during Comic-Con. And this must have been in like, 1993, maybe. It took us a couple of years to get incorporated, and we were incorporated in 1995. So I think it was probably around 93. And just to talk about like the state of the industry, what it was like, what their pain points were, what their struggles were, what kind of work they were doing, what kind of work they couldn't get, the publishers to hire them for, what kind of stories they wanted to see, what are some of the systemic issues. And these are photos from that actual first meeting. And thank God Jackie Estrada was there, who now runs the Eisner Awards, because she photographed like everything from I think the 70s until, and is still going. Like she has taken photographs at conventions and at Comic-Con in particular, because she works for Comic-Con for many, many years. And she's published a couple of books with a lot of great Golden Age and Silver Age artists in them. So So we got Roberta here, who was here at the very first meeting. Little did you know this photo would go down in posterity, Roberta. And then in this photo, this is like, this isn't everyone who was at the meeting, but these are some amazing people. So on the left, it's Lee Mars, who was among the original underground cartoonists and is absolutely wonderful. And I think had a retrospective published recently. Kim Yale, who sadly is no longer with us, and Friends of Lulu wound up naming an award after her posthumously. But she was really a force. She was a writer, and she worked on Suicide Squad with John Ostrander and was really one of the main shapers of that, actually. So anybody who liked Suicide Squad should thank her. She didn't get enough. She got some public acknowledgement when the movie came out. Martha Thomases, who was the, I think the publicity and sales manager at DC Comics at the time. Maggie Thompson, who ran the Comics Buyer's Guide for many years. Cartoonist Nina Paley, Roberta again, and then baby me in the background. And we got Mary Wilshire, who's a wonderful cartoonist, to design this character for us. And the reason we chose Friends of Lulu was it came out of, like we were joking about the whole, the clubhouse, the boys clubhouse in Little Lulu comic strip, where no girls are allowed. And that was like the whole problem with the industry mentality at the time. Yeah, I mean, as much as people struggle and talk about gatekeeping and, you know, gender and race issues in comics now, like it was very overwhelmingly male at the time. And so, so this was us trying to do something about it, basically. And some of the things that we did right away were just started trying to gather up as much information as we could. And there were a lot of people in this who had a lot of business experience. So we really kind of went about it from an industry perspective. There's the original board, hold it proudly. I think this is at WonderCon, and this was in 1995, I know, because we're proudly holding up our articles of incorporation. And that's me, Cheryl Harris, Mimi Cruz, who ran Night Flight Comics in Salt Lake City for many years with her husband, Jackie Estrada, who ran Exhibit A Press with Bat and Lash for a long time and is the Eisner Awards administrator for Comic-Con now. Liz Schiller, who did a lot of small press publishing at the time. And there's good old Heidi, who I think was working for Disney at the time and then went on to DC and then founded The Beat. So we had a regular newsletter that this was before social media. And I think when we started Friends of Lulu, we were communicating on a CompuServe forum. Like that was the easiest way for us to have our meetings. But the newsletters were great. They, I think Jackie produced an awful lot of those in the early years. I mean, like really handled the editorial duties. And we had people who like reported from a convention in Japan that we went to, and we ran surveys and, you know, news on the organization and stories about, you know, kids drawing comics. And the newsletter was really a great resource. And then one thing that we found out had a bigger impact than I think we might have realized was we did a retailer handbook. And again, this was at a time when a lot of stores, a lot of comic book shops, you know, maybe we're still stuck in this old model and not the most welcoming space for people outside of their historically male audience. And so we did this, you know, goofily titled retailer handbook, how to get girls into your store. And we got Diamond Comics to distribute it to every retailer who had a Diamond account. And we actually heard recently, like a couple of people posted about this saying, I ran a shop in the 90s and this completely opened my eyes and changed the way that I ran my comic shop. So so there were some, at the time, we just were sort of like trying to plug away and try to do anything we could think of. But I think that there were maybe some ripple effects from all of this that we didn't realize until later. We also did, we had a few different local chapters and there were a lot of different mini comics and publications put out by some of them. There were a couple of chapters in California that did a lot of these. The one in the middle, the first one on the left, I think Trina Robbins produced. The one in the middle was drawn by Joan Hilty, who is a wonderful cartoonist and editor. And then you might recognize the one on the right by one Donna Barr, The Perils of Mr. Comics. These are great. I think these are also great like time capsules. And then a program from the Lulu Awards. And I think that this was really important at the time because a lot of comics that were being nominated for and winning the major awards in the industry were superhero comics, and most of those were done by men. And a lot of publishers actually still just had the attitude that like, well, women can't draw superheroes, or women don't want to draw superheroes. So it was actually, even if you wanted to, it was actually kind of hard to get hired to do that. And so this actually, the Lulu Awards for a number of years actually were one of the only places that a lot of new talent, female talent was getting recognized publicly. And a lot of the people who were recognized early on went on to be really, do really great works, like Carla Speed McNeil and Jessica Abel and Ariel Bordeaux, all of whom were nominated this year in the 1997 awards. And I was only involved with Friends of Lulu during the 90s, but the organization did continue on into the early aughts, I think, and it was much more of a mix of professionals and comics readers. And I think the New York chapter really continued to stay active for quite a long time, and they did a number of interesting events. And then there were a few different anthologies that were published. So these are just covers of the anthologies. And comics are for everyone was really our slogan, and it like seems kind of ridiculous that we should have had to tell people that, but it needed to be said, and it still needs to be said. So having been involved in this, I'm especially excited, like I said earlier, to see that there's in the comic book medium, there's so much more diversity of among the people making comics, the people reading comics, and the actual content of the comics. Like there's just so much rich stuff coming out. And a lot of the people who are producing that, maybe a lot of them grew up reading comics from the 90s or the early aughts that came out in this like independent explosion that I was talking about earlier. So they really are the next generation. Okay, so somewhere in there, while I was helping to organize Friends of Lulu and working as an editor, was when I met people like Donna and Roberta. And it was actually a really, going to comic book conventions at the time. I don't know who else, aside from the people I know here, has been to comic book conventions, but if you've ever been to a big one recently, they were really different when I started going. And it was a real interesting period because I actually got to meet a lot of Silver Age artists and a few Golden Age artists and writers. And it was a lot easier to talk to people, basically, because people weren't quite as frantic and stressed out. And so I just met a ton of creators and publishers, and the smaller festivals, I think, are a little more like that now. So that period from 1989 through the early aughts was really like the main period where I was writing more comics and I was working as a comics editor. And I continue to be involved as, kind of I teach comic book workshops occasionally, and I do panels. I love to talk around about things like coloring, as you heard, and history. But after the last Heartbreakers book that we did, Paul and I did 2 hardcover historical fiction books that are illustrated, where we did a different kind of visual storytelling. So this is maybe, not as connected to the world of cartooning, but Boilerplate is a character that Paul created. So Boilerplate is the robot seen on the cover on the left. And Boilerplate is a robot that was created in 1893 by a fellow called Archibald Campion. And the concept of the book is basically, it's a history book with a robot in it. So we took actual historical events, worked the robot's inventor and the inventor's sister into them in a way that doesn't really significantly alter history. And then it's illustrated with all these amazing things where Paul, like beautifully photoshops it into paintings and engravings and drawings. And it is also a massive critique of imperialism and racism, but all told as a fun adventure story again. So I guess that's kind of the running theme in our work. And I'll show some interior pages and a little bit of the process of how he actually built a model of the robot for that. And then Frank Reade, they're basically in our world, they're set in the same universe and the characters know each other. But Frank Reade was actually based on a pre-existing dime novel character. So does anyone raise your hand if you've heard of Frank Reade? Okay, I never know. So Frank Reade, and I knew nothing about Frank Reade before we stumbled across these dime novels when we were working on Boilerplate initially. But Frank Reade was an insanely popular dime novel character in the 19th century. The stories were reprinted for decades, well into the early 20th century. And it's science fiction. I mean, it's straight up science fiction. And the Frank Reade, eventually he got his own series, and the Frank Reade weekly publication was the first science fiction periodical that I'm aware of. And also the guy whose collection we rated to scan a lot of the artwork for Frank Reade is not aware of any earlier science fiction periodicals. And they're basically stories about this guy who invents he starts out with robots and then moves on to vehicles. So he invents a steam man, and then an electric man, and then all these different electric vehicles. There's like a different crazy electric vehicle in every freaking story, and they are blood and thunder. Like these are those violent stories that parents of every generation complain about. So these stories, I think, actually were among the things that the Frank Reade stories actually had a really big influence on the earliest generation of pulp and science fiction writers in the 20th century, because the stories were so popular that they were reprinted over and over again, and they were reprinted like into the 20s in Britain, I think. But it's still a totally obscure character. Like only like science fiction history nerds have ever heard of Frank Reade. So with that character, we did kind of the same thing as with Boilerplate. And the interesting thing for me as a writer with Frank Reade, so with Boilerplate, the interesting thing was, how do you tell a story about a character that has no personality? Because the robot literally has no personality. So I think of him as being like Peter Sellers in the movie Being There, who is like this character who's a blank slate, and everybody around him reads stuff into him. So Boilerplate's a little bit more of a straightforward, like, it's a history book, and here is a fun robot to distract you from the fact that you're learning history. Whereas Frank Reade, we took this character from dime novel stories, treated him like he's a real person who really invented these crazy electric airships and submarines and battle wagons. And in the original stories, he is of course presented as being very heroic, and everything he does is heroic. But if you actually read them, they're like racist and colonialist, and he literally fires dynamite at Native Americans when he's in the American Southwest, and he steals artifacts from like all over the place and like raids Central American countries and stuff like this. So for me, the fun thing about this was that he still thinks of himself as a hero, but obviously from our perspective, writing a book in the 21st century, he does not look so heroic. So we made up a daughter for him, and she's actually the central character. And I love writing epistolary narratives that tell part of the story through letters and correspondence. And so both of these books have a lot of that in them. And so a lot of this book is told, Frank Reade is told through his daughter, Kate Reade, writing diary letters and journal entries and letters, and discovering like some of her father's old papers in a crazy locked chest after he dies. So we were lucky enough to work with Abrams Books on these, and they hired really great design teams, because I would not have been able to design these. They're pretty complicated, because we were trying to pack a lot of visual and verbal information into the pages, but we wanted it all to go into like a coherent order. So it's not the same as comics. Obviously, we're not using sequential panels, but there is sort of a, you know, like there's a logic for how all the images and the text are arranged together. And then we also love sidebars. I love sidebars. And so there's sidebars in both books where we're like, and now here is half a page of just history about the 1876 Constitutional Convention, or whatever it is that's like part of the story, but we don't want to bog down the story with that. So we just did these historical sidebars. So one of our, you know, with the Boilerplate book more so than with Frank Reade, the like old time life history books were sort of one of our inspirations, because we always loved the ones with pictures where they're like, and here's a photo of the actual spoon, you know? So like Boilerplate is unveiled at the, I don't have images of this up here, but Boilerplate is unveiled in the story at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago. And we're both originally from Chicago. And I grew up across the street, when I was a kid, I lived across the street from the last remaining building from that exposition. It's the only one that was built as a permanent structure. And not until we worked on this book did I know why that was. So I learned all kinds of weird little things. So that was a really fun chapter to write as well, about like the wonder of a World's Fair in 1893, when all these things came to you that you could never go see and that you could never even see a photograph of, you know? So in the rest of the book, Boilerplate's inventor takes the robot around to demonstrate it. And his idea is that, so he has a relative, the backstory is he has a relative who's killed in battle. And he vows to figure out a way to prevent the deaths of men in wars. And so he's an electrical genius. He builds a robot, of course, with Nikola Tesla's help, because you have to have Tesla in there. And then he takes it around to demonstrate it, to try and basically like sell governments on this idea. And, you know, spoilers again, nobody takes him up on it, but he does wind up participating. So in the early part of the book, it's mainly him doing kind of tests of endurance. So like they go to Alaska during the gold rush, they go to the Antarctic, they go to the Sahara. And in each of the stories, I try to like very quickly like set the stage, tell the audience, like, here's the actual history part, and now here's what the robot did. So this is, you know, in one way was our way of trying to get beyond just doing a fun story, trying to get people interested in history who might not otherwise read a history book, and also to get people hopefully to think about what they're reading critically when they're reading things that are presented as fact. Because we used to get regularly emails through our website of people asking us about the people in this book, thinking that all of this was true. So less so after the book came out, but before the book came out, we had some earlier versions of these stories on our website, and like people just thought it was real. And there was actually a whole thing where somebody included Boilerplate's character in his own novel because he didn't realize that it wasn't, like, he thought it was a hoax from the 19th century. And so we had to get into a whole legal thing with him. But anyway, so you can see a little bit of the design for Boilerplate. This was real challenging because we just kind of like wrote a bunch of stuff and did a bunch of images and had a general idea of how they would all go together. And so working with the design team that really knew what they were doing, and a publisher that was willing to let us go back and forth multiple times to really get it the way we wanted it was amazing. And I'm actually really pretty happy with how these books turned out. There's always a few things you could change, right? That's what deadlines are for. Otherwise, I would never get projects done. So this particular story is about the Boxer Rebellion in China, and we had to come up with an excuse. My other favorite thing about this book was, what's the excuse for Boilerplate being there? Like, why are they participating in the Boxer Rebellion? Like, I want the Chinese to win. Like, we were really, like Europeans were really messing with them. So they're only there because the inventor's sister got stuck there during the siege, and they just go to like get her out, basically. But in the meantime, we get to talk about like why the Boxer Rebellion happened and what the global, geopolitics were at the time. This is a little bit of process stuff. This is, again, Paul still does a lot of hand drawing in the design and layout stage. And so these are some of his early sketches trying to work out the proportions of Boilerplate. And I love this one. This is just like, should he be squat or tall and skinny? You know, what should his helmet look like? And then this is more or less, you know, more or less what the final version that he wound up with. And we've had more than one person comment, and this was, you know, he didn't measure it and plan it this way, but we've had more than one person comment that in the final version, like the eyes and the mouth really kind of hit like the golden, you know, the golden ratio. And it also has that really, this was intentional, that it has this really simplified looking face. So it looks very like, you know, even though it's a complicated Victorian robot, the face has these like big round eyes without looking like, you know, chibi art. So it sort of automatically sucks you in as if it's a, you know, a childlike creature. So this is how Paul actually did, this is what Paul actually used for photos that he then photoshopped into all the images. And there's hundreds and hundreds of images in Boilerplate. So he really did a lot of work on those, and he wrote a lot of the captions that go with the images. So he just, you know, once he had the basic design sketched out, he just went ahead and started, you know, messing around with some parts, some clay, you know, some Sculpey, and the arms, as you can see, are actually artists, you know, from a little artist mannequin. And the stuff that's inside, that's his Boilerplate's brain, is a wind-up motor from a cheap plastic toy with some wire, like some copper wire on the top. So this thing in his belly actually is the wind-up part. And we still have one of these. Paul made two of them on commission for other people, but the original one that was in our book, we still have. And then he basically like spent a lot of hours staring at Photoshop. But part of the challenge, and I think also the fun for him, was finding the right kind of image for each particular story that had a place in it that he could put Boilerplate. And in many cases, the robot isn't the focus of the image. Like in the one on the left, this is from a stereoscopic photo. So there's actually two of them. But in the one on the left, like, yeah, the robot's one of the main things. But in the one on the right, you can see this painting starts out with, this is Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders invading Cuba, basically. Again, something that seemed heroic at the time that maybe looks different now. And you can see in the middle, right next to Teddy Roosevelt, there's a human, and then Paul replaced him with a photo of the robot, which he had to manipulate somewhat. And then he spent a lot of time trying to match it as well as he could, like get rid of the guy behind him, use the boots whenever he can. He would always use the boots from the human character if he could, and the gloves, I think, in this case. And then he just did this like amazing, I'm amazed that he could do it with paintings, frankly. Like the photos, you can kind of wrap your head around it, but the paintings and engravings were a pretty big challenge, I think. And one thing we learned about one of the stereoscopic photos we own is that there was one, so we have a stereo viewer, and he would like print these out and put them together after he altered them and put them in the viewer to make sure they actually worked. So like you can potentially use the ones from our book in a stereo viewer. And one of them just wouldn't work no matter what he did, because he figured out he had to take the photo of the robot at slightly different angles to get the 3D effect to work. And he finally realized that the original part had been made with the photos on the wrong side. So printer's error from like, you know, 1905 or something like that. This is a little bit of fun that we had with our timeline. I'm a total nerd for timelines. And so both Boilerplate and Frank Reade have timelines in them. This is just a little bit of the process that we went through of like starting with this really, you know, thin outline of like, okay, these are the things that happen, you know, in the first two Boilerplate stories that that were written, and then went through like a big list of historical events where like, what else can we get them involved in during that time period? So this is all set between 1893 and 1918. And then lastly, I just wanted to show a little bit of the gorgeous engravings from the Frank Reade book. So I already talked about the character and the approach we took with him. But one of the most spectacular things in this book is these engravings, and these are original engravings that have been cleaned up in Photoshop, but not actually altered. So Paul took a few of these and altered them for our Boilerplate book, but these are actually Frank Reade engravings from the original Frank Reade publications. And these were sourced from a guy in New York State who is like one of the biggest collectors of 19th and I think even 18th century publications. And he just has this enormous collection of dime novels, and in particular has a lot of Frank Reade's. And so Paul actually went out there and scanned a lot of the original covers and then spent a lot of time making them look really good in Photoshop. And the black and whites are all from the original early run of Frank Reade, and then the color ones are reprints. And so for anyone interested in this era of engraving and this, you know, type of kind of, it now looks retrofuturist, but it was just futuristic at the time. These images are really stunning, and they have never been published anywhere else in this level of quality. So, so that was really cool to be able to incorporate them. And I love also the design on this. We worked with a different designer on this who put a lot of really fun, you know, little 19th century. You had to rein him in a little bit. He went a little too far with the 19th century scrolly stuff from the start, but I really like the design on this one. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention real quick our current project. This is one there where like a lot of our previous projects was more like 50-50 me and Paul. This one's more like, you know, 80-20 maybe. But this is a project that Paul has wanted to do for a really long time, Aztec Empire. And you can actually read the first, I think we're up to 60 pages now on our website. And this is a historical retelling of the Spanish invasion of Tenochtitlan and the fall of the Aztec Empire. So Boilerplate and Frank Reade are both historical fiction. This obviously you have to all, you know, like telling history in this form is always fictionalizing it a little bit, but this is intended to be a straightforward of, you know, factual account as we can manage based on the historical record. And it's also trying to present it in from a more balanced viewpoint than it's been shown in the past, because a lot of past pop culture depictions of this have all been from the Spanish viewpoint, unsurprisingly, since they're the ones who wrote or directed all the written records we have of this. And so it's like, and the conquistadors came and they, you know, like civilized the savages, but not a lot of attention until recently. Even the scholarly literature had been given to, well, what was really going on there at the time, and what did those people who lived there think? So Paul has done an absolute ton of historical research with this, and is, you know, consulting with archaeologists and ethnographers, and ultimately it will be printed, and hopefully it will be printed in multiple languages. But for right now, just to get it started, we have been doing it as webcomic, supported mainly by Patreon and by my salary. And so it's available for free digitally on our website. And if you know anyone who's interested in Mesoamerica in particular, or in historical comics, Paul also has a really active Twitter feed, and a lot of people he interacts with on Twitter. And he decided to, okay, I'll talk about a couple of little, and before I wrap up, here's a couple of little things that we changed about our approach. So first of all, Paul decided, we had a huge debate about this. He decided to do this whole thing in landscape layout. So these are not double page spreads unless you're printing them in comic book format. These are intended to be printed in landscape layout as one page each. And I was like, but it will make it so hard for find a publisher. And so we had a big debate about that at the start. And but he really wanted to do it this way, partly because he wanted to be able to show these vistas. And again, he's very into these, you know, kind of formal compositions. And he just really wanted to be able to show the scale, and like when he was doing a full page, he wanted to be able to have it be you know, expansive this way instead of this way. So he's doing everything landscape. And these are actually the two opening pages. And so the story opens from the point of view of the locals in Tenochtitlan, which is now underneath Mexico City, but was originally a city in the middle of a lake that's now gone, has been filled in. And so this is the scene is that there's a messenger arriving from the coast with news that like, uh-oh, some new guys in big, you know, wooden ships have arrived again, like some of those weird guys, because Spaniards had visited before. So like they were like, uh-oh, it's another batch of them. And so he comes to report to some officials in the main city. So it's opening from like the local point of view. And Paul also loves to remind people that buildings that we see as archaeological ruins with little or no paint on them in the past were actually really colorfully painted. So he's putting a ton of work into things like the designs on the buildings in the background and the patterns on people's clothing and stuff like that. And he's doing all of that. The artwork is by our friend David Hahn. He has most recently worked on a series called Impossible Jones with Carl Kiesel, and he also has worked on Batman 66 and a number of other books for various publishers. Really, really talented artist. I love his clean line style. And Paul does have some help with the coloring, but pretty much all those patterns and illustrations and whatnot that you see in the background and on the clothing, that's all him. So this is planned to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 500 pages. And at this rate, it's going to take him a while. But there's a lot of research going into it. And like I said, for people who are interested in that aspect of it or in this particular era or culture, Paul's Twitter feed and his Patreon are a great resource because he's always posting archaeological stuff and reference. Another decision we made that we did not argue about, well, we did debate it a little bit, I guess, was it's hard to see at this scale, but historically comic book lettering has been all uppercase for many decades. And that became a tradition largely because of technological limitations, because early comic book printing couldn't easily accommodate or reproduce upper lowercase lettering. Like there's some arcane reasons for it, I guess. But then it just became the way you do comics. And so every comic book I read growing up pretty much was lettered in all uppercase, and you just don't think about it. And like now when you see that, if somebody's typing in all uppercase, it's like they're shouting, right? So I had started to see more comics that were using upper lowercase lettering. And at first I was like, it's weird and unfamiliar. It's not what I grew up with. It scares me. But then I realized, I kind of like it. Like it works really well with some art styles, not, like it has to be the right font and all of that. But I'm, like words are pictures, and that's all part of the overall impact and design of a comic book page. So we decided to go that route. And it seems like a tiny thing, but like it's a really different look, going from all caps to sentence case. And then Paul, we also talked about whether or not to put borders on the balloons. And since this is very densely colored, it looked like it was feasible to do the balloons and captions without borders, which is something I've seen in a couple of series, including Paper Girls is actually one of the ones I read that does the lettering this way. And he really liked that idea. So for the most part, it's not an issue unless he has a page where like there's a really light background. But those were a couple of choices we made that give it a little bit of a different aesthetic, I would say. And that is the next page after those two. So these are the guys that the runner is coming to give the message to, basically, and they are the military commanders of the Triple Alliance, or what we generically call the Aztec Empire. So, and these outfits are all based on like historical drawings from the colonial period, essentially, because there's not much that survives from the pre-Hispanic period. So that is a little about me and my work. And I will stop sharing. And I guess a little bit of comics history in there too.
Very cool. Thank you, Anina. Any questions, anybody?
I think I mentioned in the chat there, and I don't know if you've even considered it, but when you look at a layout of a book like that, those kind of colors, that kind of richness, the children's book industry comes to mind. They do a lot of strange layouts, and they particularly like a lot of really gorgeous, well-researched books.
Yeah, we just haven't like seriously pitched it to publishers yet. And that is definitely on our agenda. We did have a couple of editors who came to us from different publishers, but those didn't pan out for different reasons. Like one of them moved on and we didn't know anyone else at that company. And the other one like pitched it to their publisher, but their publisher was kind of like, it wasn't really exactly what they do. And they were a little bit like, we're not sure that's for us. Are you waving goodbye, David?
No, I'm holding up my hand and being polite rather than just blurting out a question.
Oh,
I away. Well, you were talking about all caps lettering being the norm. There was one place where it wasn't in comics that I read growing up, which was Mad. I think in most.
Oh
of
yeah,
them,
you're right.
That was set type. And it was upper and lower case, and right now I'm beginning work on a story where I would be trying to ape Mort Drucker's style. So I've been looking up the fonts. Well, no one seems to know, but there are some very good guesses as what the fonts were. But I wonder if that was something you had in mind.
It was not. No, in fact, I totally read Mad growing up, but I think I thought of it in my mind. It was like separate from comic books, which is weird. I mean, it had other things in it besides comics, so maybe that's part of it. But yeah, I didn't think of it as the same thing as like serialized comic books, basically.
Yeah, because you're right.
Oh, and I have another question, which is. The other question I have is I haven't been reading the series, but you must be having characters speaking Spanish and also speaking in the indigenous language. Are you distinguishing them by font?
No, we did talk about like different things that we might do with fonts and with captions and stuff. And no, they just they're all speaking English in our version. And in fact, the way that Paul handles the translation is kind of interesting, like, because there's two translator characters. So there's one that comes into the story really early on, who is a shipwrecked Spaniard who's learned one of the indigenous languages. And so he's translating at the beginning, and then as they get further inland, he doesn't know all the languages, and then they acquire this teenage slave girl who turns out to be pivotal to the entire endeavor, who speaks multiple languages and is able to learn Spanish, and she becomes their crucial translator. So she's a really interesting figure in Mexican history and culture.
Oh, so you don't have scenes with just the indigenous characters speaking to each other?
Yeah, we do, but everyone's speaking English because we don't speak Nahuatl, and I don't speak enough Spanish to write in Spanish. And then if we did it that way, nobody would be able to read the whole thing except like 3 people. Mm-hmm. So our intention is to eventually get it translated into Spanish and Nahuatl, but we're producing it in English. Just like everyone talks English in them World War II movies,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how else to approach it. Like, it's not feasible for us to do it in 3 different languages at the same time.
Well,
maybe a note at the beginning. Just a note at the beginning. Just assume these people are speaking their own language and to each other.
Yeah, I've seen it done with brackets or like parentheses, you know, where there's I remember some story that was set in Mexico and characters were speaking English and Spanish, and you just had brackets setting it off, which I thought it would have been better to vary the type style.
Or you could do it in different colored word balloons or something to key readers or something different.
Yeah, that's something we might consider when because that's relatively easy to change the balloon color. So I might try and talk Paul into that. It might be a little too much color though. We'll see. I knew you were going to bust me on something, David. I was like, what's David going to bust me on?
Well, Anina, I wanted to repeat a remark was maybe just do a short prologue and say that, as you know, the natives are speaking in these languages, the Spanish are speaking as these, and there might be moments where they can't understand each other, but we will assume they're doing that, and we count on the intelligence of the reader.
Yeah, I mean, I think we actually took that for granted so much that we didn't introduce it with that. But probably when we go to print, we'll put something in there about that. There's also like copious endnotes, and it's pretty clear from the story that people are speaking their own language when they're talking to each other, and that when there's an actual interpreter in the panel that somebody's interpreting. So I don't think it's confusing for readers. People who have been reading it so far have not been confused, so they just want to see it translated. Most of them just want to see it translated into Spanish or Korean. He's got a bunch of fans in Korea too. Like there's apparently a big interest in Mexican and Mesoamerican history there.
I've got a question. I hadn't thought about Friends of Lulu for a long time. I was a member for a lot of years, but I was just like, I attended a meeting, a large meeting in San Diego, and I went to a couple of the award ceremonies. Yeah.
Reward, nice.
I think it was the one where Maurice Severin got inducted, but when did it die out, and did you have a sense as to why it was dying out?
Well, I do actually, and I'm one of these days, I actually did a bunch of research on this because I was planning to write an article because nobody's really written an actual history of Friends of Lulu. And a number of us are still friends, like Liz and Heidi and Jackie and I are all still friends. I will eventually write the article. And we also have gathered up a bunch of our stuff that we're going to donate to a university archive in San Diego. But because of researching that article, I want to say it was in the early 2000s. It might have been a little later than that. Like it might have been in the early teens. I think it was in the early 2000s. So I think there were a series of, like, I was not involved and I wasn't there firsthand. All I can say is from what I was able to glean from talking with people and from reading, you know, accounts from that time, there were like a series of leadership changes, and there was, you know, for a while there was, you know, some personality conflicts, and then there was like one person who had a real different opinion about what the organization should be, you know, should be doing. And so I think that, you know, it just sort of reached a point where I wouldn't say that it outlived its usefulness, but I think that there was nobody left to drive the bus who wanted to drive the bus anymore. It happens to a lot of nonprofits after a while.
Absolutely. I knew it wasn't because everybody breached the goals. And
yes, because everything's perfect and egalitarian now. Yeah, so, and there was like, I mean, there was like a whole thing that I don't want to go into publicly, that there was a debate apparently about whether or not to do fundraising for this one particular cause that was actually outside of the mission of the 501c3. And you can't do that. Like, you'll really get in trouble for doing that as a 501c3. That was one of the things, but like I said, I wasn't involved in, and I don't know firsthand any of that, but my impression is that it just sort of got to the point where, nope, there's no more bus because nobody wants to drive it anymore.
Okay.
And I think Liz Schiller actually stepped back into the driver's seat for a while, and she's done a lot of work in the nonprofit sector. But you know, it takes more than one really dedicated people and a few volunteers to keep that going.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting doing the research though, and I gotta say I love the Wayback Machine because I was able to find our original website through the Wayback Machine, and I went back there and like found all these key dates and old photos and illustrations and stuff. So it's like, oh, thank God.
Dave
I think I talked way longer than 45 minutes. Sorry about that.
No,
I
don't
looked
worry.
at the clock and I was like, oh no, I'm sorry.
As you recall, I said that was the average. David has another question.
Yeah,
No.
hi, from David Lasky. That was a great talk. I came in the middle. Sorry about that. I was in a different webinar and had to join late. But seeing the boilerplate process images just made my day, because that book is so convincing. To this day, I've wondered, how did they do that? So it was fantastic to see just all the work and care you put into it.
Oh, thank you. We really did. That was for sure a labor of love. Yeah.
I'm not surprised somebody thought it was an actual fictional character from 100 years ago, because it's so convincing.
Yes, that was Chris Elliott actually. And it was yeah, he was very unhappy when he found out that it was actually someone else's creation in the 20th century.
My question, the Aztec Empire looks amazing, and it'll be huge. And you mentioned briefly that your salary was helping to fund it, and I might have missed things because I came in late, but if it's like 500 pages, is there other sources of funding like crowdfunding or?
Oh yeah, Paul has I just meant that I have a full-time job in an industry that pays better than comics now, right. Basically, was all I meant by that.
Is there one?
What's that?
Is there one?
Nothing pays better than the sheer love of working in comics, right? Paul has a Patreon, so we you know, like that's a trickle funding, and we're debating whether to do Kickstarter or a different platform to kind of get to the next stage, and we also really still need to shop it around to publishers. Like, we haven't seriously shopped it around yet.
Right. Well, I wish you the best, because it'll be fantastic if you can make a 500-page or multi-volume graphic novel in that format. It'll look fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, and that means a lot. Yeah, and definitely wish Paul the best in actually finishing it. That's a lot of pages.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason that I would like to either do crowdfunding or get a publisher lined up, just so that we can be like, okay, you know, like, now we have said that we are going to put this book out at this time. And once again, it's the deadline driven personality, I guess. Like, once we have a deadline, then the project is like real and it's really happening and we have to finish it.
I think there's a Portland comic book art museum that's in the works, and are you somehow involved in that? I think I saw your name.
You know, I gotta get back in contact with the guy who is driving that. Yeah, there is actually Mike Rosen. a local guy named Mike Rosen, is, I can't remember how the idea originally came up. I think it was like people just talking about it, you know, in real life and on Facebook. And Katie Pride, who owns a wonderful comic shop here called Books with Pictures, please visit if you're in Portland, had like said something about it on Facebook, and we were commenting, there totally should be. Yes, absolutely, there should be one here. And I think maybe it was because we were reminiscing about the Oregon Historical Society exhibit, because that was the only big museum exhibit on local cartoonists that I've ever seen in Portland. The only one. The only other comic book exhibit I've ever seen at a museum in Portland was a giant Robert Crumb exhibit, and they only did that because he did the Bible.
Right.
So yeah, like the museum world is still, you know, like there has been one outside of Portland. So there have been museum shows in Eugene and at the Maryhill Museum, which I think is actually in Washington on the other side of the river. But they've done comic book exhibits, but Oregon Historical Society is the only one in Portland outside of that Crumb exhibit. So yeah, people were like, yeah, there totally should be. There's enough. I mean, there's multiple publishers here. There's probably hundreds of comic book creators here. Tons of animators and cartoonists of all kinds. So yes, I think Mike is like really like he's getting stuff done a lot faster than I could. So I'm glad that he's dedicated and he has like I think good administrative skills from his work background. So putting him to good use.
Cool.
That's right. Note to self, get back to Mike.
No, I saw your name in connection with it. So.
Oh, okay. Then I definitely should check with him, because I was like, yeah, I'm totally in. And then, you know, and then I think he was forming a board, and I can't remember if I got back to him or not. I am also, what's that?
No, I read an article in the Seattle Times, and I think he or whoever they interviewed, as I assume it was him, mentioned you as one of the local cartoonists, local creators, and so I thought maybe you were intricate.
Well, he and Katie and I met to talk about it, and then we didn't realize how fast he was actually going to get stuff done, because she and I were both like, oh man, I don't have any bandwidth to do, you know, like serious time commitment on this, and he was like, well, here's what I'm going to do, and he just like went off and did it. So I think, you know, more power to him. I think he's doing amazing. But yeah, I am really excited about it, and I do want to be more actively involved. So I will follow up with him. I am on the board of a broader arts nonprofit in Portland called Siren Nation, that's dedicated to gender equity in the arts, and it started out mostly around music, but we've done a lot of other types of programming. So I was doing organizing a virtual workshop and speaker series last year, and this year I've mostly been working on grant writing and organizational development.
Okay, cool.
So that's my other thing, because I don't have enough things that I do. So
it's like the old line about give the job to the person who's the most busy.
Well, I certainly want to thank you for one, I think, of our better meetings with an amazing history and illustrations. Just let's hear it. And I really appreciate it. This was just wonderful.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for not leaving when I went over time. I swear to God, one time Paul and I did an interview, and because we'll just like I said, we love sidebars. I love sidebars. One time we did an interview, I think we were in Salt Lake City, and the guy asked us one question, and then like 15 minutes later, he was like, okay, I think I got what I need. Because we were just like, well, so when we sat around to make this book, we did blah, 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 and then blah, and we did it for this because blah, 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 blah. And when it's both of us, we're really like feeding off each other. So yes, that's my favorite example of that.